to languish and go backwards. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I call the Honourable Minister Wayne Mack.
Mr. Chairman, I, funnily enough, heard Mr. Stuart Nash say in relation to that last speech, good speech. I was a bit surprised to hear that because the opposition got one of New Zealand's foremost scientists and indeed entrepreneurs to speak at their conference, made that person their keynote speaker, Paul Callahan. So I was anticipating, they're obviously planning something pretty big, something very significant as a way to sort of project their commitment. The commitment, actually, I've just heard Mr. Shearer talk about at the very heart of the economy. So what was their big idea? What was Labor's big idea? The thing that really was central to their conference, to take New Zealand to a bold new era. It was, in fact, a rehash of the tax credit, maybe a little bit more targeted, because they're limiting it to $200 million. And that was an increase of about $100 million. However, there was a hook in that increase, because if you look at the New Zealand economy in the broad, you've essentially got three core sectors. Primary sector, over half of our exports, and indeed part and parcel of why the current account deficit is reduced, because they're doing so well at the moment. Tourism, 10% of the total economy, huge foreign exchange earner, and I guess you would say manufacturing, particularly high-value manufacturing and advanced services, particularly in tertiary education and ICT. So what Labor's big idea was to push up the extra spending in the high-tech sector and take that money directly from another sector, the farming sector. And I thought, that's actually a zero-sum game. That's no real change at all. And this is Labor's big idea. And that's why I was surprised to hear Mr. Nash saying, good speech. Because I can say to the opposition, if that's as good as it gets, I suspect you're going to spend a little bit more time sitting on those benches than one might think. Because what they said to New Zealand's largest export sector, the primary sector, we're going to take $160 million off you directly as that zero-sum game. So our most profitable part of the sector, export sector at the moment, was going to be soft. Hardly an innovative policy, Mr. Shearer. I want to return to the facts of the situation. In 2008, Labor's last budget, they spent or appropriated $689 million for R&D. That was actually during a time of relative economic success for New Zealand in line with much of the rest of the world. We have appropriated this year $773 million. That's a gain of 12%. The difference is, of course, we had to do that in a time of relative economic difficulty, and in particular when faced with the cost of reconstruction in the Christchurch earthquake. There was, in fact, did you hear that? They just say, oh yeah, as if it's of no significance whatsoever, that New Zealand is going to spend $6 billion. New Zealand taxpayers are going to spend $6 billion to reconstruct Christchurch, and to the opposition, as reflected by Mr. Shearer, they just says, oh yeah. Is that what they really mean? Is that what they really mean about Christ? I might actually give them a little bit of credit and say, maybe I misheard that. So, Mr. Speaker, there's just kind of like an absence of reality in, how can I put it, their rhetoric and their delivery. Can I just say this, Mr. Speaker? So $689 million in 2008, $773 million in 2011, a 12% gain. And next year, there'll be further gains because as a result of budget 2010, they're effectively 4-year budgets. Each year has an increase. So the technology development grant started off at $22 million, Grows a bit more this year, next year 60 million, following year a bit more. So that's a progressive increase that flows through into each budget. Well, it is. Well, we've voted, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Dr. Wayne Mack.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make it clear that the distinction really between an R&D tax credit and a technology development grant. The problem with Labor's plan is they just shower the money out like confetti, just give it through to the accountants, and essentially say, well, you know, if you can rot the account system using highly paid accountants and lawyers, then that'll do. And we looked at that and said, had they actually increased the level of R&D as a result of that sort of undirected tax credit system? The answer is no. So we've taken a smarter approach. We've analysed it by New Zealand's most R&D intensive companies, and Mr. Shearer knows who these are. These are in fact set out in a publication called the TIN 100 publication, which sets out the top 100 R&D intensive companies, and we'll progressively work through those companies with the intent that each and every one of them will receive a technology development grant. That is the intention, because we know that for R&D intensive companies, they will actually invest the grant directly into increased research. And that is the fundamental difference to just simply sending it through the tax system. Now again, you see, you hear from the opposition their fundamental sort of misunderstanding. So he's saying they'll just offset it. So I just have to ask him, so how does a tax credit targeted through accountants lead to a behaviour change? How does it do that? The answer is actually, in fact, as Mr. Quinn said, it actually doesn't. You actually need to focus on the companies who've got the culture of R&D and then invest in them. Look, I acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, this. I do acknowledge that in 2011 we did have a difficult budget. At least on this side of the House we acknowledge that. On the other side, just reckless spending. They just have this long list of promises, completely oblivious to the fact that we're actually running an 8% deficit as it is, one of the larger in the developed world. I guess they would have, what, 12, 14, a matter of real indifference to them. Maybe Greece is the kind of country they'd like to emulate. Because I actually went to Greece recently and I saw what happens when you let a deficit get completely out of control. So in the current environment, you have to make realistic choices, sensible choices about dealing with debt, dealing with growth, putting the country back on track, setting an agenda that is predictable, that is sustainable, that people can believe in, that gets you back on a pathway towards growth. And can I say to members of the House, every week the Honourable Paula Bennett provides to her colleagues the situation of unemployment, both youth and regional. And I can say to members that in virtually every region in New Zealand, unemployment is less this year, significantly less in fact, than it was last year. And the lines are heading in the right direction. So there is a sense of some level of recovery, reflected in part by that increased exports from the primary sector. And perhaps I can just close on this point, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. Labor's plan, in essence, is to kick the feet from under our most productive sector. New Zealand needs to understand that that is their big plan, to take money from New Zealand's most productive export sector and say that is a plan that will grow New Zealand. Well, I say to New Zealand, that frankly is a bankrupt policy and will fail and will be seen as such by New Zealanders. They are looking for sustainable, realistic, predictable, sensible plans that take New Zealand to the future. Those plans rest with National, they do not rest with Labour.
I call the